So what we're going to focus on today is the post-fall of the Soviet Union issues with mostly the communist nations because they're going to be the ones that are affected the most by the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we're going to look at the remaining communist nations and talk a little bit about the United States. Remember, the United States remained as the only major superpower after the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll see China start to rise up, but for about 20 to 30 years, the US stood at the apex of its power. It was the only one really left standing. We're going to talk about the difficulties faced by those communist nations, some of them former, and then we're going to talk really in depth about ethnic tensions. So remember, an ethnic group is people with a shared heritage, but it's a specific group of people. They have to almost have a lot in common. They share traditions, they usually share religion, they share a language, and that kind of bonds them together. So we're going to take a look at Yugoslavia, which is going to be our poster child for ethnic conflict during the post-Soviet, post-Cold War years. So Yugoslavia was a federation of different nations. If you look at the map in the left-hand corner, you have Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. And they're all kind of jammed together into this pan-Slavic nation ruled by that guy in the bottom left, Tito. And he's so brutal, he's able to keep these nations together. So it's a socialist, it's a communist nation, but it's independent from kind of the USSR's sphere of influence. It does its own thing. They play the United States and the USSR off against each other so that they can keep their control over this little area down in what's called the Balkan line areas. So Tito eventually dies, and Yugoslavia begins to have ethnic nationalism flare up. These different nations start to want their own country because they say they want a area just for Croats. They want an area just for Montenegrins, just for Serbs. But if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, that's the ethnic map, and you can see they're all mixed together, so nobody knows where the borders should be. Even though this map is in French, it gives you an idea of the different groups and where they roughly were in Yugoslavia. So some of the borders are fairly clean, but you can see a lot of times there's different groups mixed in to other groups' areas, sometimes totally cut off, especially if you look at the green, the Muslim areas. Now, technically Muslim is not a ethnicity, but it was treated like one in Yugoslavia, and it's going to be a major issue, as we're going to see, when the Serbs and the Muslims begin to have conflict with each other over where their borders should lie for their nations. So Yugoslavia eventually breaks up into 6 nations. The first one to go is Slovenia, then Croatia, and then the big one that happens is Bosnia and Herzegovina breaks up. Montenegro eventually says it wants to secede from Yugoslavia, and Serbia tries to kind of keep the whole thing together. Some nations broke away very peacefully, like Slovenia, but most of them, it was through violent civil wars. And this is because all those ethnic groups are all mixed together. All those religious groups are all mixed together. Nobody knows who's going to get what piece of land, where is the border going to go, and it's going to cause many, many issues, ethnic cleansing, genocide, to try and figure that out. So some examples of the ethnic tension was first, Serbia invades Bosnia. Bosnia wanted to break away from Yugoslavia and form its own nation, and it's majority Muslim. But what happened was the Serbs who lived in Bosnia didn't want to leave, they wanted to stay a part of Serbia. So they began what's called the ethnic cleansing of the Bosnian Muslims. They began saying, basically, you leave this area that's going to stay a part of Serbia or you die. And the idea is to push them into smaller and smaller regions so that the Serb areas can then stay with the Serbian nation. The UN tries to negotiate the conflict for 3 years and it's unsuccessful. So NATO, who is still an alliance, still very powerful, they really have nobody to check them now because the Warsaw Pact is gone. They decide to bomb Serbia. So they bomb Serbia to stop the war. And in 1995 in Dayton, Ohio, the Dayton Accords are signed and that ends the war. And instead of UN peacekeepers, NATO peacekeepers are sent in to enforce the Dayton Accords. They're going to keep the Serbs and the Bosnians separate. They're going to patrol the border. They're going to make sure that there's no ethnic cleansing or genocide going on. But it's not over for the conflict because in the 1990s, Kosovo wants to break away. So Kosovo is actually a part of Serbia. It's in the very bottom south of Serbia, and they are Albanians. So Albanians live in Kosovo. They don't want to live in a Serb nation. They want their own nation of Kosovo. But the Serbs who live in Kosovo, who are a small minority, they want to stay. So the Serbs begin to push out and ethnically cleanse the Albanians in Kosovo to try and keep Kosovo and Serbia. NATO again bombs Serbia, sends a peacekeeping force to Albania or to Kosovo. So we kind of see a trend of NATO is now the one going out and enforcing like world peace and trying to stop ethnic cleansing and genocide. The issue of Kosovo, though, is still not resolved. There's still or NATO peacekeepers there. There's still violence there between the Albanians and the Serbs. I know this is kind of confusing with all the different ethnic groups, but the main thing I want you to understand is that ethnic groups are so mixed together, and even though they may look like the same culture, they consider themselves separate and they want their own nation based on their people. So you can see some of the pictures here. The bottom left, the bombing of Serbia by UN forces. The far right is going to be the ethnic cleansing, pushing out Bosnian Muslims away from the Serb border. So this is Kosovo, and you can see some of the issues in Kosovo is they're very mixed together. You have Serbs all the way up in the north, but then you have Serbs all the way down in the south. So where's the border supposed to be? If these Serbs want to stay with Serbia, shouldn't they be allowed to? But also, if the ethnic Albanians want to form their own area of Kosovo, they should be allowed to. But the borders are so muddled that it makes it very, very difficult to decide who is going to get what territory. So some other communist nations and their transition out into the post Cold War world, you have China is probably going to be one of the most important. So when the Soviet Union falls, China stands as the world's most powerful communist nation. But they see that they have to make some reforms or they're going to go the way of the old Soviet Union. So they do some reforms, and China now has this like hybrid capitalist socialist system, and they still have that today. They do not reform their political system at all. Actually, lately it's gotten a lot worse. The communists are still in power. There's no freedom of speech. They actually have something called the Great Firewall of China, which blocks places like Twitter, Facebook, Wikipedia, so their people literally can't get to it. They crack down on pro-democracy protests like the Tiananmen Square protest. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, there are all these protests in the 90s calling for democracy in China, the opening of the political system, free market reforms, and the Chinese send in their army. They crack down on it. Thousands are killed. So the Chinese Communist Party still remains firmly in power. In Cuba, Fidel Castro actually only stepped down in 2008, and the Communist Party is still in control, but Cuba's been slowly reforming. A lot of their people are beginning to call for elections, free market reforms, and that's because the Cuban economy is struggling. A lot of people can't find work. It's very, very poor in the country overall, and slowly their relations with the United States have improved. Some Americans are now allowed to travel to Cuba. There's a little bit of trade, but it remains to be seen if Cuba will eventually flip from communism and have elections and possibly become a democracy. In North Korea, as everybody knows, it's still a communist totalitarian dictatorship. It is ruled by the Kim family exclusively. Everybody knows the guy in the bottom right-hand corner. They're called the Hermit Kingdom. They've completely cut themselves off from the rest of the world. There's no freedom. There is no free market reforms. Everything is controlled by the Kim family. They have constant famines. The economy struggles. But North Korea does have nuclear weapons, and we're going to see if that becomes a major issue because them and South Korea technically never really had a peace treaty. They're still technically at war, and there's a lot of tension there. In Vietnam, free market reforms in the nation, even though it's still communist. They kind of do that hybrid style that China did, creates an economic explosion. Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It's doing really well. The Communist Party is still in control, though, and there is no democracy. But again, people are beginning to call for it slowly, especially with the internet and the free exchange of ideas happening there. The Communist Party is having more and more challenges to its rule. So overall, nations that transitioned from communism over to democratic capitalism face some very similar issues. One of those was their command economy, their communist economy, was replaced with the free market. While that sounds like a good thing, anytime you switch your economy, it's going to cause a lot of issues for a few years. So the government suddenly stopped providing a bunch of goods and services. They stopped providing, free healthcare, free education, food, and that caused a rise in prices for everything. It caused a lot of factories to go out of business, which rose unemployment, and it caused crime. But eventually, the economy kind of evened itself out, and the standard of living did rise. Political issues, the transition to democracy was difficult because there's still people who believe in that old system of like a communist dictatorship, total control of the government, total control of the press, no freedom of speech. Some succeed, like Poland. Poland transitioned very quickly into a democracy. Their elections have run since the very first year they threw out communism. They've had a bunch of different political parties, but others struggle, like Russia, who essentially has had Putin as their president for the whole of them being a democratic nation. So that kind of goes over all the struggles that these nations faced and the transition from communism into the modern world that we now have. So this will leave us off at about 1995, and then we go into the modern world.